academia, vivat professores, vivat academia, vivat professores, vivat membran qualibet, vivat membran qualibet, semper sint in flores, semper sint in flores. Vivat omnes virgines, faciles formose, vivat omnes virgines, faciles formose, vivat et mulieres, dulces et amabiles, bona laboriose, bona laboriose. Vita nostra rebis est, revivietur, vita nostra rebis est, revivietur. Venit mors velociter, rapid nos atrociter, nemini parsetur, nemini parsetur.
Your Excellencies, students, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Stavros von Franz and I'm the Vice Chancellor of Lund University. It is a great pleasure for me to welcome you to this year's Anna Lindh lecture. We are honored that Stavros Lambrinidis has accepted our invitation to give the lecture. Stavros Lambrinidis is the European Union's Special Representative for Human Rights and the former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Greece. Human rights is a prioritized subject at Lund University, and I'm proud of the research and education at both undergraduate and graduate level which is carried out at many of the university's departments. The Raoul Wallenberg Institute of Human Rights and Humanitarian Law has a long-established reputation, both in Sweden and internationally, and plays a significant role in the university. Both Raoul Wallenberg and Anna Lindh are role models who have demonstrated that one person can make a difference, thus inspiring young people to continue their work. Their dedicated work has contributed to a better world and serves as an inspiration to the younger generation. The Lund University is also pleased with the cooperation between the important and active student association, the Association of Foreign Affairs in Lund, and the Anna Lindh Memorial Fund. Today's event includes music sung by the Lund Chamber Choir. And I'm very pleased that for the 11th time we have been able to arrange this annual event in the commemoration of Anna Lindh and her legacy. And immediately after this ceremony, you are all welcome to attend the reception which will be held in this building. Once again, a warm welcome to all of you.
Vice Chancellor, Excellencies, students, ladies and gentlemen, it is a very great pleasure and honor for me to welcome this year's Anna Lindh lecturer, Mr. Stavros Lambrinidis, the EU Special Representative for Human Rights. I cannot think of anyone better speaking at this year's Anna Lindh lecture than you, Mr. Lambrinidis. Anna Lindh was, as we all know, deeply involved in the role of the European Union, not only internal but also in the bigger world. And her commitment to human rights is very well known. Mr. Lambrinidis has a long and very distinguished career with both a US and a European leg. He has a JD degree from Yale and was the law advisor of the White House during Bill Clinton's presidency. He also served as a president of the Committee for Human Rights in the Bar Association of Washington, D.C. And then, of course, the European leg, which again has two legs that almost adds up to four legs, I don't know. A career in Greece and a career in Europe. You have a long, distinguished career in the foreign ministry, which was crowned in 2011, where Mr. Lambrinidis became Minister of Foreign Affairs of his country. His EU years started in the European Parliament in 2004. Here he has held a number of prominent posts. Most prominently, he was elected Vice President of the European Parliament in 2009. Finally, all this added up to where you are now, being the EU Special Representative for Human Rights, appointed in 2012. And let me say here on a personal note, the best man got the job. And I think I'm one of those who can say it because I was one of the other candidates. The job came about as a very long-standing request for a representative that would be in charge of enhancing the effectiveness and visibility of the EU's human rights policy. The post is aiming to cover fields such as the strengthening of democracy, international justice, humanitarian law, the abolition of death penalty, and of course human rights broadly speaking. And I must say it's impressive to see how you have developed this mandate as the first mandate holder. It's very impressive. And of course, as I think everybody in this room would recognize, it is needed today in Europe, globally, more than ever. So with this, I think we're all anxiously waiting to hear you speaking about where are human rights, how do you see the human rights developments in Europe, in the world today, and hopefully also some suggestions on how we can move on. Thank you very much.
This is a very ex-cathedra setting for teaching, not used to it back in the United States. The professors usually sat lower than the students to indicate almost respect to the student intellect. I am so honored and pleased to be here. Mr. Vice Chancellor, thank you so much for the hospitality and the invitation. And it's not any event; it's the Anna Lindh lecture. And Anna, for many of us in Greece, for a number of reasons, is and has been a hero for European values and for human rights. I certainly had the chance to very briefly meet her in my earlier days, mostly through George Papandreou, who eventually became the Greek Prime Minister, but who during the dictatorship was here, living here, taking shelter here in this country. I have to say that in our thoughts and in our memories, Anna herself and her work, but also Sweden more broadly, stand out as pillars of Greece's liberation, Greece's move from an authoritarian regime to a democracy and human rights back in 1974. So I'm really, really deeply grateful for this opportunity. What's so scary about smart girls? Why did Boko Haram decide to abduct 200 girls from school in Nigeria a couple of years ago instead of just going ahead and just bombing one more army barracks, which they were sort of good at doing? Why did some extremists plant a bullet in Malala Yousafzai's head in Pakistan? What's so scary about smart girls? What's so scary about smart girls, I submit to you, is that if they are smart and educated, they change entirely the power structure in any society. You know, you can still beat up a woman, I suppose, if she's educated, but it's not as easy. A smart, educated woman has an opportunity to get in the workforce, be empowered economically, be empowered politically, have a voice. You change entirely power structures. And this is precisely, of course, what terrorists don't want to see changed. That's so scary about smart girls. As we are facing in Europe as well a terrorist threat and dealing with it around the world, I think it's quite important to think about that. If you look at what terrorists hate the most, maybe you have a good idea of a strategy to deal with them. They most certainly have shown us they don't like education, and they don't like educated boys and especially girls. When they killed the Charlie Hebdo journalists, they signaled to us that they simply cannot stand freedom of expression and different opinions. ISIS today is trying, even in countries where power structures are already collapsed or collapsing, to bring an even greater collapse in institutions, because independent institutions are something that terrorists certainly don't want. Freedom of religion and belief, freedom of expression, education, rule of law. What are these if not human rights extraordinaire? Every one of them. You want to fight terrorism? Support human rights around the world. Support human rights around the world. This is, if you like, the first reason why the European Union is so strongly focusing on its human rights foreign policy the past few years. It is because human rights are not soft policy. They're not a footnote in foreign policy. Our 28 presidents and prime ministers decided back in 2012 that they would place them at the center of our foreign policy work. And indeed, if you were to look around the world today, I submit to you that you would not find a single bloody conflict, whether cross-border or internal, that doesn't have at its roots some major human rights violation. Or that in order to resolve it, you don't have to address some serious human rights challenges. Human rights is not soft policy. It is hard foreign policy. You want peace in the world, you want stability, you have to do human rights. That's the first reason why the European Union is placing special emphasis on it. Second reason that we promote human rights so powerfully around the world, or that we want to. Well, frankly, you know, every peoples have a history. Every people develop identities. We in Europe, in the European Union, have human rights and the rule of law in our DNA. And it came out of the fact that we were possibly the greatest violators of human rights a few decades ago. The Holocaust being, of course, the most remarkable exemplification of that violation. But indeed, we were killing each other. Now, many of you in this room are too young to remember, of course. But after that blood was shed, we managed in only a few years to unite and to create what is possibly the biggest, the most hopeful, the most free, the most open, the most tolerant, the most prosperous region in the world. And that was not easy. I mean, people, their neighbors had killed them, and vice versa. This is not only important for us, mind you, but it turns out it is even more important for many people around the world that I visit and I talk to. While we may have forgotten in many instances our roots and what brought us to this place, they have not. There are bloody wars happening around the world and people want to get out of them. And they all too often look up to us and to our experience to be able to find some inspiration of how to get out of the vicious circle of violence that results in death, economic destitution. Or after the European enlargement a few years ago with new member states, especially from the East, the experience that we have had as Europeans to integrate, to bring democracy so quickly to countries that were under undemocratic regimes is something that also inspires people around the world. I think that we have to keep this in mind, especially when we are dealing with human rights challenges today in Europe ourselves. Keep in mind, in other words, the fact that it is a so-called soft power, boring power, that has made a humongous difference in our lives, and that millions of people around the world look to it to see if it can make a difference in their lives as well. Human rights upon which we build ourselves are rights that we have to keep protecting passionately if we're going to keep the credibility necessary to promote them around the world. Third reason I submit to you that Europe is anxious to promote human rights around the world. You know, after the 1990s and the fall of the wall and the initial exhilaration of that change, the world has changed again. It's become a much more dangerous, much more a place where many more people around the world feel scared. They're trying to find their identity. Who are we really? Where are we coming from? What do we believe in? What defines us? There's a lot of uncertainty around that. And in that context of uncertainty, power, sometimes authoritarian power, makes right. Might is right. You hear and you see that a lot. It is in Europe's fundamental interest to ensure that that kind of might is not right, because that is not the kind of might that we have and we wield around the world. Sure, we have armies and we have guns. We don't use them. We don't want to. We don't believe that this is the first way in which you address major challenges. And in fact, in this context, respect for international law, respect for law more broadly, becomes in our hands the most important and the strongest weapon for our own interests, but in our view for the interests of people around the world. Human rights is strong law, international law. It is in our interest, because we want to make sure that we defend international law, to be in the front lines of defending human rights as well. That's the third reason. Now, I can mention a fourth reason, And that is our economic interests, if you like, to bring it away from the values debate and closer to the more hardcore interest debate. It is virtually impossible. It is our submission in the international discussion and debate on this topic to have sustainable development, to be able to have environments around the world where companies are willing to invest, where there is security and respect for that investment and for that sustainable growth, if the country that we go to has no rule of law, has no human rights, has no freedom of expression or speech. I was in China recently on an official visit, and the Chinese government was describing to me their goal of moving away from being a cheap producer to being a country that actually designs and exports goods and services. And my question was, how can you go from made in China to designed in China unless you have universities such as Lund that allow people to speak out and debate openly, that they can access the internet and read even controversial ideas and articles about different topics, scientific, political, what have you? Is it really possible to go from made to in to designed in without those fundamental things that would allow minds to open up and to innovate and to think creatively? It is in Europe's economic interest, in addition to the other interests, to ensure that human rights get promoted. Now, given that, around the world today we are facing a number of challenges in human rights, and they are very serious ones. The first one has to do with the universality of human rights. In many ways, after the 1990s, when the wall fell, I submit to you that we had both an explosion of freedom and of a human rights culture around the world, but also the beginning of the sowing of the seeds of some of the challenges we face today against human rights. The universality challenge, to give you an example, stems quite often out of a very strong anti-Western rhetoric. Indeed, you see countries around the world today having recovered from the shock of the 90s and developing more rapidly their own economies around the world and the greater geostrategic interest. You see them challenging the human rights architecture. They will tell you very often that human rights are a Western concept that was imposed, rammed down their throats at a time where they were not ready to react. That in fact, human rights is culturally relative. That it was developed in the West under a certain set of cultural understandings. And that unless other countries in the world reach the same level of cultural understanding, not all human rights apply to them. That is a huge danger for human rights because it attacks their universality. A huge challenge for us. If any country around the world and any government can pick and choose what human rights it respects and applies, given its interpretation of what its political system, its culture, or its religion considers appropriate, then not only is the universality itself as a concept of human rights in danger of dying, but the whole human rights architecture is in danger of dying. So it is the European Union's obligation to focus on defending the universality of human rights as strongly as it can. When I have this discussion with people around the world, here's what I usually tell them. I tell them that as interesting and appealing the anti-Western debate may be in their societies, it is deeply dangerous and entirely false. Because human rights, in fact, have never been a battle between different cultures or religions or political systems. They have always been a battle within them. I often use the example of abused women. In Athens or in Stockholm or in New York or in Johannesburg or in Beijing or in Moscow or anywhere else in the world, the victims, the powerless, they will never complain if you go and speak on their behalf. The husbands doing the beating and the governments that refuse to arrest that husband will very often tell you, stay away, you have no right to intervene. We have special family values here you don't understand. Leave us alone. They're the powerful. Human rights has always been the universal language of the powerless against the cultural relativism of the powerful. In any religion, in any country, in any region, in any political system. A battle, as I said, within cultures, not between them. And that is key in discussing, in my view, the universality debate around the world. Second challenge, the attack on civil society that we see. Again, I submit to you the seeds were sown in the great successes of the 1990s. In the past few years, we see civil society being imprisoned, being accused of being foreign agents, being often deprived of any funding and therefore strangled economically to oblivion, very often being arrested and thrown in jail, and in some instances even killed. Mind you, by governments, but also by private individuals, by businesses. Business and economic, social, cultural rights are rights that find many human rights defenders around the world in grave risk. I was in Brazil recently and we're discussing, Morten, this topic with the Brazilian authorities quite extensively because, as you know, there they have a real issue of losing lives to not governments directly, but to private individuals who don't like activism against land grabbings or other issues such as those. So, again, some governments will try to dismiss civil society at the same time that they're repressing it. Who are they? Who do they represent? Who cares about them, really? Why are you Europeans talking about them? Well, the fact of the matter is, if civil society had not been successful, governments would not be repressing it. It is part of the success of civil society, of its strength, not of its weakness, that today it is in the crosshairs. But I submit to you that the reason that the European Union cares about them, in addition to their individual capacity of enjoying the freedoms and the rights that they should, including the right to life and the right to free speech and assembly, is because in the end of the day, human rights will not take root in any country in the world unless they become the ownership of the people of that country. I cannot go around the world and impose human rights. The EU will not use weapons to do so. It is the people themselves in a country, the governments, the courts, the newspapers, civil society, the professors, who will make a difference. Those countries who repress their civil society are directly ensuring that human rights in their countries will almost never have a chance to take root. So when we promote human rights, we look at the civil society challenge as one that is fundamental as the universality challenge in ensuring that human rights eventually, not immediately, eventually succeed. A third challenge, I put this to you to discuss it really. Maybe I'm wrong. It's been bothering me recently. I've been thinking about it, but we can discuss it. On the way that we are asked to promote human rights is that maybe European publics are less interested and focused on the topic today than they were a few years back. And you know, human rights have to be promoted by many people, but mostly by governments, which means by politicians. And politicians do look and listen to what their voters say or believe as important. You know, there could be many reasons for this. I mean, one is obviously that, you know, terrorists in the past few months and years have really raised the bar of people's attention to human rights violations. You know, when you've seen and been disgusted by a decapitation on YouTube, and I come to you and I say, you know what, there are 10 really important civil society activists in prison in Egypt, and they shouldn't be there. And if they continue being there, stability in Egypt and democracy is really at risk. You know, I get people telling me, come on, you know, where's the blood and gore? I mean, why should I be paying attention to this? Another reason may be that when some challenges hit home here in Europe, whether it was the terrorism challenge or the asylum seekers challenge, many of our publics got scared or got pushed or encouraged by some politicians to get scared. And the consequence of that fear, the request to a government is deal with this issue, deal with terrorism, deal with the bad migrants. And all this is basically a call to immediate action that doesn't necessarily always need to focus on human rights obligations. And we have seen, unfortunately, in a number of our countries in the European Union, challenges, human rights challenges when we deal with these topics. We had major debates at the European Parliament a few years back about privacy on and off the internet when it comes to fighting terrorism or fighting security challenges, pushing European governments, pushing the European Commission at the time, pushing the Americans who were negotiating agreements with the European Union on issues such as bank data transfers or airplane passenger transfers, pushing them to pay attention to human rights. Now, of course, after the big NSA issues and Guantanamo and all these issues and renditions, the renditions broke out, more people focused their attention here. At the time, I remember the European Parliament and some of us there were fewer and far between raising the issue. But it turns out that it's extremely important, of course, because, as I said at the beginning, it's our DNA. And if we lose it, as easy at times as it may be politically too, we have lost the battle in the long term. So our public opinion's sensitivity to human rights is also important. And let me then move now. Once I've talked about the why we do human rights foreign policy in the EU, and once I've touched upon the challenges, let me tell you very briefly our strategy for addressing human rights violations around the world in our foreign policy. I could formulate this in many ways. It may sound a little gimmicky, but I have done it in the context of what I call the 7 E's. I'm sure you can think of additional E's or maybe less E's after I'm done with my 7 E's, but sometimes I found that it helps to try to focus one's mind on a difficult challenge, even by using such so-called gimmickry to organize your thoughts. First E in our strategy, empowerment. The European Union is focusing today on empowering human rights actors, individuals, and institutions around the world, because we cannot always impose human rights. Most of the time we can't. Because it has to become the ownership of the people on the ground that human rights is important. Empowering civil society, not just financially, but also politically. There's not a single country in the world that I visit that I don't openly meet with prominent civil society activists or others who are not that prominent, but that we have identified as people who really are making a difference in the countries. But it is not just civil society. It is independent judicial institutions and courts that, if they exist and if they are empowered, they can promote the rule of law much better than anyone from the outside can in any particular country. It is an independent and free media. It is independent national human rights institutions. It is empowering everybody on the ground who can make a difference in the country. And you know what that means essentially? It means that, because the question of the debate today, of the discussion today, really is, is Europe still retaining its leadership role around the world on human rights? I would say yes, but here's how. By empowering, by, in other words, bringing down the European Union flag as opposed to lifting it up everywhere we go. My goal is not to be going around the world telling people, or people back in Europe for that matter, that we are great, that we are the great holders of the human rights wisdom and heart, and that we tell people what to do. I feel that we have to do, at this very difficult circumstance, do almost the opposite, empower others to take the leadership. Now, second E, engage. In order to promote human rights around the world, we have to engage, and I have to engage with all kinds of different governments and countries and institutions, sometimes really bad ones, sometimes really repressive ones, sometimes even abhorrent ones. In other instances, confused ones, governments in transition, trying to figure out how you move from a dictatorship to a democracy, what the limits of free speech are or are not in that process. What do you do? And the reason we have to engage is we have to build trust. For better or for worse, it is through building trust with many different governments around the world that we have a chance, maybe, to begin changing hearts and minds in those countries, including in their high institutions. I told you at the beginning that indeed human rights is the language of the powerless against the powerful, that educating girls changes power structures. Well, those in power don't necessarily want the power structure to change. You have to be able to engage with them, and that means talking to some people you normally wouldn't want to. It would be very easy for me, or for us as Europeans, to just sit back home and once in a while issue a statement condemning this terrible human rights practice or the other. But we probably would not be able to make a real dent in the systems that we are condemning unless we manage to find a way to engage with them. Third E, enlarge. A huge emphasis of my work is to enlarge human rights coalitions around the world. A major element of that work involves regional human rights organizations or institutions. The ASEAN, the African Union, the League of Arab States, the Inter-Americans, others. This, I believe, is probably the best way for us to address the universality challenge. It is by enlarging coalitions that we ensure that human rights does not appear to be simply something that the West talks about, but allegedly no one else cares about. Picking up the human rights baton on any one of the major topics that we're discussing by people you wouldn't expect in different regions around the world is a fundamental way to ensure that universality is safeguarded. Let me give you one example. A few months ago, I invited the Organization of Islamic Cooperation Human Rights Institution to visit Brussels. Many of you might not know it even exists. And in fact, when it was first established, it's nascent a few years back. Its instructions were basically to support a general principle that human rights are not universal, that there are special cultural values involved, and to move in that. And in the past few years, some very enlightened people who felt empowered in that institution, although their instructions were different, started changing the debate. And now the debate in the OSCE Human Rights Commission level is more to the direction of the universality of human rights than you might expect. Last year, a year and a half ago, the OIC Ministerial Council had a decision. That decision was to announce that it condemns female genital mutilation as violating the Quran and principles of the Muslim religion. You can imagine, of course, how more powerful this statement is coming from the OIC Council of Ministers than it is coming from me or from anyone else in this room. And large coalitions on human rights to defend universality of human rights is the third E, the third part of our strategy. Fourth E, encourage. We have to encourage changes in human rights, and that means that we have to change our rhetoric. I believe and I feel that our human rights rhetoric in some instances is rusty. Going around the world today and telling people only and simply that, look, you signed into that convention, you signed into that agreement, you have to respect it, end of story, is a powerful argument. Of course, there is a responsibility to ensure that one fulfills their signed obligations, but it ignores the fact that the arguments, the different interpretation, the counter-arguments on human rights have become much more sophisticated over the past few years from those who oppose the universality of human rights than we had been used to. We have to manage to encourage changes in human rights, and that includes both through our rhetoric, the way that we address human rights challenges in different countries, the way that we encourage countries to see the value of human rights and its application for their societies, their economies, not ours, in a way that we almost didn't have to do 10 or 15 years ago, when human rights were on a triumphant upswing. So that is a challenge for us in Europe, to renew our rhetoric, to be able to find ways to ensure that where we cannot enforce, we can encourage. Can you encourage human rights through your development aids? Absolutely yes. Absolutely yes. And it is a shame that for many, many years in Europe, EU member states and the European Union were doing development aid without having placed the human rights dimension in the center of the development aid debate. How it is, in other words, that you do a human rights-based approach to development. I am very pleased and proud, frankly, that in the past few years, both the EU and the leadership of some EU member states, including many Nordic EU member states, has made a big difference in the way that we are beginning to do our new development aid today. Fifth E, enforce. There are times where encouragement doesn't work. We need to be able, as the European Union, to enforce human rights in the worst cases of their violation, whether it is mass atrocities, of course, or other instances, imprisonment of civil society activists for expressing their views, for example, in so many different countries around the world. There are two elements in the enforcement leg of our strategy. One, of course, is the International Criminal Court. I mean, that is the court that is out there, established by the world community in order to address the most egregious violations of human rights, war crimes, crimes against humanity. It is even it that was supported by so many countries in the world when it was first created, not all, under challenge today. A major emphasis of my visit last month to South Africa, and last month as well for a major dialogue with the African Union, has been to discuss the importance of continued African support for the court, as it was indeed African nations, together with European nations, that were behind setting it up. It is the victims' voices that we are all here intent to support. And my hope, my encouragement to many of these governments is to come back to that joint cooperation at the court level. Another level of enforcement has to do with EU public statements. I don't know how many of you here are in the work for NGOs or in the NGO community in Sweden or elsewhere in Europe. But this is a constant discussion and debate, and frankly a quite difficult one. There's no magic formula. You never know exactly when to speak out and when not to speak out, but I will tell you one thing, as far as I'm concerned, and they're difficult decisions to make. You have to take the responsibility for making them. I certainly do every day. The Federica Mogherini, the foreign policy chief of the European Union, takes that responsibility every day. I'll tell you one thing that is, for me, extremely important, is to ensure that my criterion is not for me to look good when I make a statement, but to ensure that my statement actually can get someone out of jail. If I determine that in some instances that I may be doing harm than good, then I may refrain from making a public statement, although I will not refrain from being extremely forceful diplomatically at a diplomatic level. But that is always a difficult decision to make. One thing I can tell you, however, is the following. Maybe I don't need to say this here because of the leadership of many Nordic countries in human rights, including in foreign policy, but I do say in many member states of the European Union. It is, first of all, I tell their diplomats, look, I was foreign minister, I know how it works. I don't remember having too many human rights pages in my briefs when I went on foreign visits. Maybe it was in the end on page 150. You know, and if I was lucky in the plane, you know, sleepless, you know, I might actually reach it and read it. You know, it has to be in there. And it has to be in there in our discussions, both because no one takes us really that seriously around the world if we are major European politicians and we go to countries with major human rights problems and we say very little about it. Because the moment that we do this, people think, you are not consistent with your principles, you are not being serious. I don't believe you because you seem to be afraid to raise issues with me that, yes, they would annoy me, yes, I would reply to you, yes, it would make for a slightly unpleasant meeting for a few minutes, but the fact of the matter is I would respect you for doing that because I know you're coming here with a foreign policy that is driven not just by cold-hearted, bloody interest, because I thought you as Europeans were different. Your DNA was different. If it's not, good to know. Then I can divide and conquer you as easily as I want to, by offering the right oil concessions to this country and the right training concessions to another country. But there's a second reason why I submit to you we have to raise human rights, and sometimes in this enforcement element of our strategy. And it is because, in fact, in many instances, not all of them, in many instances, making a statement increases the chance for engagement. My 30. That may sound counterintuitive, but in fact, I have seen it time and time again, that when the European Union collectively, all 28, make a principled statement at the United Nations, let's say, Human Rights Council or Third Committee, on a particularly grievous human rights violation in a particular country, that country will of course not be happy. But very often I will get an invitation to visit that country at the highest level after that statement. Not before. It is a mistake to think that sometimes being vocal will shut doors. No. It could, but no. It's not the rule. So politically speaking, we have to think of that. 60, embody human rights. Embody. asylum challenge in Europe, dealing with terrorism, economic and other inequalities within our borders, privacy. These are human rights challenges for us. Our main weapon to be effective in promoting human rights around the world is to have strong credibility on human rights domestically. There's virtually no country I visit that at some point in the debate someone will not tell me, what about the way you treat asylum seekers in Europe? What gives you the right to come and lecture us and tell us about this, that, the other, when you have this or that or the other issue? I think that that is a legitimate debate to have. Now, keep in mind, in their wisdom, the 28 prime ministers, and when they created my position, said that I was explicitly excluded from dealing with human rights violations within the EU. That was something that Morton had in his plate as director of the Fundamental Rights Agency. And let me open a parenthesis here. I am deeply grateful for your kind words, Morton, and I don't know if I'm the best or not the best person for the job. I know that I looked up to your leadership, which I very often quoted in my foreign visits, to indicate how Europe is putting its money where its mouth is and is trying to make a difference. And in fact, I wish that EU member states follow up much more closely the reports that you come up with and feel a stronger obligation to do something about them, because some do and frankly some don't. But let me close this parenthesis on you and your leadership in this matter. Now, I submit to you there are three consistency challenges that we are facing when we do human rights in our foreign policy. The external consistency challenge, the external consistency challenge, and the internal challenge. External, the obvious. Are we practicing what we preach? I will tell you something about that, what I talk around the world a lot about. We are not perfect in human rights in Europe, mind you, and we're not perfect in member states. And I think that sometimes we've given the impression that we think that we are, and that is a shame. Because it has actually killed our credibility to some extent, going around and pretending that we are fantastic. No one is perfect in human rights, but having said that, that does not mean that therefore everyone is equally imperfect. I am especially proud of the way that Europe is dealing with these human rights challenges. And by this I mean by the minimum things that it has in place to ensure that we cannot shove those challenges under the carpet. What I tell many countries I visit around the world is I don't expect them to be perfect, and they shouldn't expect me to be perfect. But what are they doing to ensure that they will be forced to strive to be perfect? Independent courts, freely elected parliaments where members of parliament can raise what they see as human rights violations without being thrown in jail for it. A free press and an open internet where people can discuss issues. Independent human rights institutions, above all else, an independent civil society with which you may very well disagree as a government person. I most certainly don't agree with everything civil society tells me. But you have an absolute obligation to ensure that you discuss with them, that they have the freedom of space to do that conversation, because they will keep your feet on the fire. So I don't expect anyone else to be perfect, because I know I'm not, but I do expect, at a minimum, and I'm willing to work, to engage, to encourage, to support changes in different countries that will put those minimum things in place. Now, many more things to say here, but I'm not sure I have a debate. 7th E, elevate. Elevate the EU's image on human rights. Here's what I mean by this. Two things. I want us to elevate our image as world conveners of human rights people and forces. Are we leaders? Sure, we are leaders. You know, when I talk to our friends in the United States, the leadership discussion is a big thing. The Americans always want to be leaders of everything. I want to be a convener. I want to lead the human rights change around the world by being able to convene human rights forces and make a change and make a difference, not by leading from the front, but leading from the back if I can. I think the European Union, for all the reasons I explained before, has that capacity and that obligation. Some countries say, you're not leaders, the European Union. Look at business and human rights. In Geneva, we are trying to get a legally binding instrument on business and human rights, some countries, and you, the European Union, oppose it. You don't want a legally binding instrument. What I say is, okay, we can have a discussion about this and a debate about this, but can you tell me if in your country you have a national action plan in place under the existing United Nations principles on business and human rights to ensure that you do the right thing so that your companies don't violate the human rights of the workers and of the people? Because if you don't, and in many cases those who talk about the EU stance don't, I'm willing to support you to have it. You take the leadership. You do that. Let's get out of that big debate, politically charged debate, that is so easy to just disorient people, and let's just be practical. I am willing to convene the right people, put them together, support you to make the move. You be the leader. You be the leader. So, first element of elevating our leadership and visibility. We are becoming, I hope, I believe, a convening power in human rights. Second element of elevating our image in human rights. I have placed an emphasis, and the EU member states now are as well, from the beginning of my mandate, on elevating the awareness of people around the world on the work the EU does on economic, social, cultural rights. Now, many of you studying human rights know, of course, that you have civil, political, economic, social, and cultural, 2 different UN conventions. For civil, political, one, economic, social, cultural, the other. When we talk about the universality of human rights, as Europeans, we have an obligation, I believe, to make sure that we promote all of them. There have been a number of instances, again, visiting around the world, that people tell me, well-meaning people, also ill-meaning people, people who basically don't want to change anything and they just want to rub it in my face, kind of. But well-meaning people, they have been saying, look, thank you very much for this whole discussion about, freedom of assembly and association in our country, and yes, we do have some issues, we don't let, assemblies happen and we throw some people in jail, and yes, that's an issue, but, we also don't have shelter over our heads and foods on our table because we're extremely poor. What is the EU doing about that? I mean, you are well fed and you're running around the world telling us, about, all these other rights. And, freedom of the internet, yes, important, but we don't have that many people on the internet here. The one thing we certainly also don't have is, as I said, shelter. Well, here's a fact. The European Union is about 8% of the world's population. We're about 20% of the world's economy. Only 8% of the world's population, only 20% of the world's economy is contributing over 56% of the world's development aid every year around the world. I am very proud of that. Because what is development aid in the end of the day, if not human rights aid extraordinaire? We don't call it human rights aid. But if it builds schools that girls can go and boys can go and learn and be empowered, if it builds hospitals, if it builds wells, as it does so often in places where water doesn't exist or clean water doesn't exist, what is human development aid if not human rights aid? I don't know why we don't call it human rights aid. Maybe because when we started building our social safety nets in Europe and our welfare systems, we never thought of it as a human rights work. We thought of it more as a social obligation or something else. In fact, it's quite interesting, as an aside, that we don't really talk about human rights in the EU, really. I mean, what was Morton's agency's name? It was not the Human Rights Agency, it was the Fundamental Rights Agency. In Europe, we have fundamental rights. Do the Americans have human rights? No, what do they have? Civil liberties. You have the American Civil Liberties Union. So we have fundamental rights, they have civil liberties, the rest of the world has human rights. I mean, we have to come to terms with the fact that what we have done in our societies and what others have seen us done, for better or for worse, is human rights work. Our welfare states and welfare systems, the fact that we have managed as Europe to be so much more equal and more peaceful and more developed than so many parts of the world, is seen as a human rights achievement for many people, and in fact it is. And our development aid can and does achieve the same, but we don't know it and we don't discuss it. And we should, because that is a fundamental element of our credibility. Dear friends, let me close with this. About a year and a half ago or so again, a very famous human rights defender from Belarus, Ales Bielaski, came to visit me in Brussels. He had just been released from prison in Belarus. He had been there for a number of years. And he had been released 3 days earlier. And the first thing he did, he felt the need to do, was to visit Brussels to thank the European Union for the work we had done on his release. That is remarkable. And that is deeply human and deeply touching. And there are tens of human rights defenders in 2015 who are out of jail because of the work that we did. Work often that is not advertised. There are hundreds that were relocated when their lives were in danger because of the work that we did. Thousands of trials of human rights defenders have been observed and are being observed as we speak around the world by the European Union and its member states, sending a strong signals to governments and courts around the world that we do care, and we do focus, and we do notice. What we do is extremely important for saving our souls, because human rights is our soul, and if we abandoned it, we would injure ourselves more than anyone else. But it's also extremely important in changing people's lives around the world. This is why we have to keep fighting for it. This is why we are. This is why I feel that as so many crises around the world are happening, the European Union is proudly still standing, expanding, not reducing its human rights presence and its human rights instruments. And if we keep that commitment going, frankly, in a job where you wake up every morning and your computer screen flashes with 10 more arrests and how many more crises where your instinct might be to give up, to throw your hands up, to say this is not possible, we cannot make a difference. Well, I think that if we keep it up, we can. And if we can change those lives around the world, if we can care about the rights of others as much as we care or should care about the rights of ourselves, we're saving our souls and we're changing the world to the better. And I don't think that's a dream, I think that's a reality. Thank you very much. Can I come down? If you want to come down. Stay here.
He stays up there.
No.
Are you directing it? No. Okay. Good. I am. Yes. Exactly. Very good. Perfect. Good. Very good. See, do we have a mic, or is that me? That's me. Fine. That's multitasking.
Thank you very much for a lovely lecture. The question I had was about, should I hold it closer or less far?
No, you're good, you're good.
Okay, the question is about Egypt, and since the Arab Spring and the spread of terrorism and ISIS, we obviously know that there's a lot of human rights abuses in Egypt, but I was just wondering what you think about European governments such as the UK's interest in keeping a stable Middle East and how that sort of may brush human rights violations under the carpet. What your thoughts on that are, please.
Anyone else? Will you take a few?
Yeah, sure.
Oh, hi. Well, you speak, first of all, thanks for a great lecture. You speak a lot about the universality of human rights, specifically on the receiving end of having human rights. But can't we also discuss the importance of seeing the responsibility for human rights as universal, that we're all responsible for every human and all of their rights?
Last one before. Yeah, we have a.
Thank you. I am from Kenya. My question relates to development aid. EU has been making significant contribution to development, and especially to people who are regarded as the poor. And a lot of this aid actually get lost through corruption. And there is significant implication on human rights, access to basic human rights by people with vulnerabilities. What is EU doing to ensure that such people who are supposed to benefit from EU aid actually get to benefit and stop suffering these basic human rights violations? Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Mr. Lambrinidis, I think if you would reply to this, and then we'll take another round after a few more.
Now, you know, in Egypt, when I was there last October, I met, you know, with a number of ministers discussing the human rights issue, and at the time, the government has started arresting a number of non-religious, I mean, secular human rights activists, which was a very, very worrying trend for us, for the European Union. I spoke to them about this, and the European Union also had a joint statement on this at the United Nations level. But also, Egypt had in jail about 25,000 at the time Muslim Brotherhood members who, at the time that they were arrested, there was no proof that you know, they were in any way directly related to terrorism or terrorist attacks or anything like that. And I talked about this, and I said, and I asked specifically the public prosecutor of Egypt at the time, who was also largely responsible for implementing, you know, very strictly laws that would on the books, laws that didn't necessarily comply with international human rights standards in the EU's view and in many others' views. About this, and I asked him if he wasn't afraid that, you know, that this policy would, in addition to everything else, lead to radicalization of people who are not necessarily radicalized. If he wasn't concerned that, in fact, by putting civil society members in jail, secular NGO people in jail, he was jailing some of the greatest allies of the Egyptian government in the fight against terrorism, because in fact it is those who advocate freedom of expression and freedom of association and the right to education and all those things that, as we talked at the beginning, are those who in some ways are driving a silver bullet through a terrorist, master plan. And he basically dismissed what I was suggesting or asking as European, niceties without having any knowledge of the Egyptian society. I have to say, and I say this with great regret and with great with great concern, that the public prosecutor, who also told me that I should feel entirely safe in the Egypt that was being built, especially because of the measures that were being taken, was murdered in his car outside of his office about 2 or 3 months after my visit in a horrendous terrorist attack. I think in some ways, what I do try to do in my visits, including in Egypt, is to change the narrative, if I can, on what it is that security means and how best it can be achieved. And in fact, it is sustainability more than security, or sustainable security, if you like, that should be the goal of anyone fighting terrorism. The sustainability of this effort means fundamentally that you have to do it in a way that does not radicalize, in the end of the day, more people than are already radical, does not alienate people who are allies in this battle. And in the case of Egypt, we feel, the European Union feels and has said, that this principle has not always been followed, and certainly not recently. So our concern and our engagement with the Egyptian government continues to be, and will continue to be, one that very strongly focuses on the importance of applying and retaining human rights. The UK government, together with every other government in the European Union, made this twice recently, this public statement on the importance of respecting human rights, of letting people out of jail, of fighting terrorism while respecting human rights publicly at the United Nations level. I absolutely, in the second question, I absolutely agree with the individual responsibility. You cannot impose that on anyone, but in some ways, I suppose, the reason that I have focused on elevating the EU's profile on human rights is because I do want to be able to try to re-inspire our public opinions about the importance of human rights work. If public opinions do understand that human rights work is hardcore foreign policy, not an afterthought, if they do see that the EU is actually a major player in the human rights field throughout the world, not a follower of anyone, if our public opinions do see the results on the ground, the people being freed, the laws being changed, in addition to seeing our failures. The difficulty of the human rights field, of course, is that the failures sometimes are many more than your successes. But when our public see the success, I hope they can be inspired. Because indeed, we are all human rights defenders in some ways. And we can be. I talk about educating girls. Well, who's educating those girls in all these dangerous parts around the world that being a teacher of boys and girls exposes you to the threat of death many times? It is people who say, well, I'm a teacher, I'm a dedicated teacher. They're human rights defenders in a sense. I mean, who is behind those people if not NGOs and the NGO community around the world, international NGO community for years, for decades, consistently. The human rights defenders have their own human rights defenders in the international NGO community, and they most certainly have very strong allies in governments. As many strong enemies as they have developed because of their successes maybe around the world, they should know, and they do know, that they have also some very strong friends. But you're absolutely right to point out that it is when the individual, the last one of us in this room, feel that we are human rights defenders ourselves, we have this obligation that we can really, really make a difference. It's easier said than done. And honestly, I'm not, you know, you have to be a little bit of a dreamer in my job, I suppose, because otherwise you just, you know, jump in a lake and die, you know, because of the frustrations of the everyday failures. But the fact of the matter is, you know, you also have to be a hardcore realist. I don't expect individuals to be the carriers of human rights obligations, although I do recognize that good individual actions promote human rights around the world as much as good government actions do, and bad individual actions also violate human rights. But I talk to governments a lot, while I empower individuals at the same time, to tell them you have the obligation to ensure that human rights is being protected. You cannot turn around and say, oh, it's not my fault. There's this militant group that is killing people, therefore I have to stop them. They are violating human rights. Of course they're killing people. But the obligation to ensure that your people are safe and that you do so while defending the human rights of all is a government obligation, not an individual obligation. Interestingly enough, because I mentioned business and human rights, when the United Nations adopted the so-called Ruggie principles back in 2011, the guiding principles, not mandatory but very powerful politically, for businesses to be promoting human rights around the world, it talked about the government's responsibility to protect human rights when it came to business enterprises, but the business's responsibility to respect human rights. So it used a different word, a different verb. And indeed, we all have a responsibility to respect human rights, but to protect them. That is what governments are exclusively obligated to do under international law. So this is where we come in, empowering the individuals in order to respect human rights and promote them, and encouraging, enforcing, enlarging coalitions, engaging with different governments to make sure that they protect them. Finally, it's a very good question on development aid. The European Union, as we speak, has come out with a new human rights-based approach to development. And a big part of that approach focuses precisely on looking at issues such as, where has the money gone? Has it benefited the people who should be benefited? And the corruption debate is a very, very big and a very important debate. I believe, by the way, that we should be making allies in this discussion of the people on the ground in any particular country, and I'll tell you why. Many times governments around the world don't have the capacity, or they don't want to, in some areas, spend money to develop their societies. They turn to many of us, including here in Europe, and say, you give us the money, you support us in this. But you know what? If a school in the end is not built because that money went into some government official's pocket, I am very upset back in Brussels because I gave the money, but the person who really, really is the most upset, and we tend to forget about that, is the person on the ground who would have gone to that school and can't. Corruption creates, in addition to being a crime, in addition to creating tremendous inefficiencies in economic inefficiencies, it creates huge inequalities. One of the biggest challenges in the world today that I believe that Europe has to face, including domestically in our borders, is even in the middle of the economic crisis, the large increase of the gap between the few rich and the many poorer. That is a gap that you see dramatically in many countries around the world that may be improving their economic development performance, but inside the countries they are creating a tremendous social and economic inequality that could blow up in their faces. Dealing with human rights and giving human rights to people in their countries to address those issues guarantees that those issues will not be shoved under the carpet and that social stability may in fact happen. Allowing people to expose corruption is in some countries something that is very unpopular. People are being thrown in jail, of course, for it or killed or otherwise. Well, they shouldn't be to begin with, but the fact is that the moment that they are, the chance that this economic inequality will be reduced disappears, because the people who are your watchdogs are being thrown away. And that is an alliance with the people on the ground in those countries that the European Union is building and should be building, in my view, even more, in addition to our own mechanisms to ensure that our money goes to the right place.
Always happens when you have a fascinating, interesting speech on an engaging issue. Time is running, so I will suggest that those that I promised a second round, that you get hold of Mr. Lambrinidis afterwards and discuss it, because I'm afraid we have to move on in the program. So sorry for that. Good.
Many thanks to Lund's chamber choir for this beautiful music. Dear Stavros Lambrinidis, Let me, on behalf of the entire audience here, express our warm thanks for an eloquent and inspiring lecture on the tremendous challenges lying ahead of us globally, and on the role of responsibility of the European Union and its member states in making human rights a reality for each single individual. 2015 was not a very good year when it comes to human rights. Two notable achievements were noted: the adoption of the new Sustainable Development Goals Agenda, the agreement in Paris on environment and climate change. But on the whole, human rights seen today can be considered rather bleak, both globally and regionally. Let's all hope that we can be a bit more optimistic when we summarize human rights achievements this new year. In the meantime, we must continue to work in the spirit of Raoul Wallenberg and Anna Lindh, believing that it is possible to make changes, make a difference, and not being indifferent. Standing up for universal values and human dignity is indeed needed when the respect for human rights are threatened around the globe. From listening to you, we know that human rights are in able and considerable hands. Thank you very much. With these words, this year's, actually last year's, Anna Lindh's lecture has come to an end. I remind you of the Vice-Chancellor's words that you are all invited downstairs to the reception. Thank you.